All right, friends, good day to you. It is October 30th. Luke chapters 14 through 16. So we got 3 chapters and a lot of material. Can't hit all of it, but I'm going to hit a couple of important high points, particularly with material that we have here that is unique to Luke's gospel. Okay, so we get more in chapter 14 of healing miracles. Jesus again eating at a Pharisee's house. Probably for the purpose of watching Jesus perhaps trip him up in conversation. They can accuse him of something. And Jesus effectively ends any of that by healing people. This is, the way to have people kind of stand in the corner and try and figure out what they do next. All right. Talks about humility and hospitality starting in verse 7. This is really an important theme in Jesus's teaching. That is, humility is the way of the kingdom, and not seeking your own status and not seeking to inflate yourself, but rather seeking the way of humility. Kind of tough in our world, no doubt about that, but we need to find ways to reflect the kind of humility that Jesus reflected in his ministry. All right. So what I really want to talk about is because some of this stuff we've all dealt with in Matthew and Mark, but there are 2 stories unique to Luke. And the first is the parable of the prodigal son. And that's in chapter 15, starting with verse 11. And then in 16, you get the story of the Rich Man and Lazarus, 16:19. So I want to talk about those 2. That's what I want to do this morning. So the parable of the prodigal son is probably one of the most popular parables, along with the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's interesting that my Wesley Study Bible, in this section, the heading is the parable of the prodigal and his brother, because the brother also figures into this story in important ways. All right, so we all know the story. There's 2 brothers. The younger brother is probably grows up on the farm, and he's bored at home. And when my daughters were teenagers, we lived in a rural area, and they kept saying, "There's nothing to do here. It's just boring." Well, that's probably this guy. He wants to make something of his life, or he wants to go to the big city. And he doesn't want to wait. He's impatient, right? We all know when we were, well, for those of you who are young, but for those of us who are no longer as young as we were, we all felt we were going to be young forever, right? So he probably thinks time is wasted, so he's got to have his inheritance. So he says to his father, "Give me my share of the inheritance now." Now, in Judaism, again, the inheritance, the oldest son got a double portion. In this case, the older son got a double portion. So what traditionally would have happened, is that upon the man's death, his estate would have been divided into thirds. The older son would have gotten 2/3, the younger son would have gotten 1/3. And so he comes to his father and says, "I kind of want that now. I want that now." Now, in this culture, this is just insulting. In fact, this is it's egregious, because basically what the son is saying to his father is, "Dad, I really wish you were dead now, so that I could get my stuff." So the father must have been aggrieved, and he would have been well within his rights to say no. And in fact, who knows? Maybe he could have taken some steps to try and disinherit him for this. This is very insulting. But the grieved father gives the young man what he wants, right? We say at times, be careful what you ask for. So he takes 1/3 of the estate, and off he goes to the bright lights in the big city. And Jesus tells us that he went out and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. So he partied it up big time, and who knows what he did? Who knows how he behaved? We don't know, but let's just say he lived a high life and didn't think about tomorrow, right? And so he finally gets to the place where he's out of loot, and severe famine takes place in the land, and he begins to be in need. So what does he do? Well, he looks for a job. He does what he has when you're out of money. He looks for a job. He hires himself out to a citizen of that country. Now, so this is not Jewish territory. This is somewhere in Gentile land. All right. This is outside of Jerusalem and Judea and probably out of Galilee. He's somewhere in Gentile country. What is his job? He goes out. He's been sent out to the field to feed the pigs, and he is so hungry. In verse 16, he would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. This is as low as a Jewish boy can sink in the first century, that you have to resort to feeding pigs that are unclean, right? In Jewish kosher laws. You have to not only feed the pigs, you're looking at what they're eating and you're saying, wow, that looks really good. So he's at the bottom. He's below the bottom. He is as low as you can go. All right. So verse 17 is interesting, and I like the New Revised Standard Version translation. It says, but when he came to himself, and that's a good way to translate it. Some translations have when he came to his senses. It's not bad, but this is better. When he came to himself. In other words, when he rejected his father and his family and his way of life, he had lost himself. A big part of our identity for all of us is where we're raised and who we are. And some of that is not good. There's some of that we probably at times wish we would have been able to throw off. But, our identity is formed by our context. We don't choose for ourselves who we are in some cases. I mean, we do have to decide who we're going to be and make those decisions. But we don't get to choose where we're born. We don't get to choose our parents. We don't get to choose our economic status. We're all born into a situation, and that situation helps to feed and form and shape our identity. So when Jesus says, when he came to himself, when he realized who he really was back there. Okay, because when he went off to the far country to spend his money, that wasn't who he was. He had rejected who he was. So when he comes to himself and realizes who he is, he thinks, well, you know what? I can't go back. In asking for my inheritance, I'm not a son. I'm not this man's son anymore. But maybe he'll hire me as one of his hands, right? And he pays them. He pays them pretty well. They have food to spare. They have food even to spare. And so that's what he does. He gets up. And he rehearses ahead of time what he's going to say. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. So he's got his speech down. So he sets off, he goes to his father. And then in verse 20, we read, but while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. And then the son said to him, he gave him the rehearsed speech. Now, something here to say. This father, first of all, in the ancient world, the elderly did not run, even if they could, okay? But it was considered that the elderly were worthy of respect and that everyone else should be on their time. So the elderly didn't have to be in a hurry. And so he, first of all, doesn't have to run, but that's what he does. Running in the first century world, typical man who's wearing a robe and inner garment, you have to pull up your robe, whereas the King James would say you have to gird up your loins. This is not a real pretty sight. So he girds up his loins and he goes out there and he runs out. He throws the offense he's been given. He throws the insult that his son had hurled at him in wanting his inheritance. He throws the shame to the side of the road and he embraces his son. His son gives him his speech. And the father says to the slaves, doesn't even answer him, doesn't respond to him, doesn't he? Verse 22, quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive. He was lost and he is found. And they began to celebrate. He brings him back. He doesn't need to. In fact, probably the average Jewish father in the first century would not have done this, but he does. And you can just imagine the townsfolk, the village folk, the other farmers just scratching their head at this father who had been so dishonored. And this is a culture of honor and shame, who has been so dishonored and is willing to throw that to the wind in order to bring back his son. And kill the fatted calf that you're always saving for a special occasion. You know, you don't have a lot of meat in this world. So if you have the financial means to have a calf to raise when it grows up big enough and you have a special celebration, you kill it. And so that's what he does. And so he welcomes him back as his son, restores him as a son. Now, the older son is out in the field working, an important point, right? The younger son shirked all those responsibilities. The older son, being the dutiful older son, is out in the field and he is working. He hears the music and dancing, and he goes and asks one of the slaves what's going on, and the slave tells him, and in verse 28 we read, then he became angry and refused to go in. In some way, you can't blame him, can you? He's been the dutiful son. He has put his life, he has sacrificed to be a faithful son. And no doubt, when his younger brother left, he probably picked up some of his duties too. So one can understand, right? The older son who has been responsible. But the father comes out and pleads with him to come in. And this older son says to the father, listen, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. And yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. I don't know if you've had goat. I have. It's pretty good. But even a goat, a cheap goat, not a calf, not a fatted calf. And then, but he says, when this son of yours, notice that he doesn't say this brother of mine, when this son of yours, because he had, in rejecting his father, he had rejected his brother too. This son of yours, not my brother, this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes. Well, we don't know that. Dissolute living is not good living. So maybe that was part of what he did. When he comes back after having what he done to you, and you kill the fatted calf. Wow. But the father has a response. Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. The younger son has squandered his inheritance. He's not going to now get a portion of what is going to his older brother. His older brother now is entitled to all the estate, and he will get it. So he's not going to get cheated out of what's coming to him as far as the estate. But he says, and he also says to him, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours, notice that, he reminds him, this brother of yours, he's your brother. This brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found. The older brother, the problem with the older brother was not that he necessarily didn't have a good argument to make, but what the older brother struggled to do was what I like to call being extravagantly gracious with grace. And that is what God has done for us, friends. He's been extravagantly gracious with us in Jesus Christ. And we don't mind showing grace to people, but we struggle to show extravagant grace. And that's what this brother is guilty of. And so it is a reminder to us, all of us prodigal sons and daughters, that God has shown us extravagant and lavish grace. And for those of us who are in the image of God the Father who welcomes us back, we need to be extravagant in our grace too. We need to be gracious with grace. So that's the prodigal son. Now, one more story I want to talk about is the rich man and Lazarus. This is a parable. So, by the way, this Lazarus is not the Lazarus of John's gospel. Lazarus is not an uncommon name, just like Jesus is not an uncommon name in the first century Jewish world. So there's this rich man, and he was dressed in purple. Purple is very expensive in the ancient world. He had fine linen, and he feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate, oh man, did he have his own gated community he lived in? At his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus. He was covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Think about this. Remember Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, where Jesus says she wants her daughter healed, and Jesus says it's not fair to give food to the dogs before you feed the children. And she says, well, I just want scraps from the table. The image of dogs under the table, laying under the table, waiting to get anything that falls from it. We've got the same. Lazarus is like this, like the dogs. He's just longing for anything that the rich man might happen to drop, so that he can feed himself. And the dogs would come and lick his sores. This is just a horrible existence. This is a terrible image to think about. So the poor man dies. He's carried away to be with Abraham. The rich man dies and is buried, and the rich man goes to Hades. Now, by the way, I need to say something. This is not a parable about the nature of hell. This is not the point of the parable. By the way, let me recommend to you, if you really want to reflect on heaven and hell and eternity and all of what those things might look like from a human perspective, I would recommend C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce. It's a wonderful read. And I know it sure helped shape me in thinking about some of these things. This is not a parable about the nature of hell. It's about wealth and poverty. And it is about living what we believe. Okay. So the rich man is being tormented, and there is Abraham and Lazarus. Lazarus is by Abraham's side. And in Hades there, Lazarus calls out and asks Father Abraham, just send Lazarus to dip his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I'm in agony. But Abraham said, child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner received evil things, but now he is comforted here and you are in agony. Again, it isn't the problem with the rich man is not that he had wealth. The problem is he wasn't generous toward Lazarus. He wasn't generous with what he had received. Okay. What's interesting then is that in verse 27, then Lazarus says to Abraham, then Father, I beg you to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, so that they will not also come into this place of torment. And Abraham's response is interesting. They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them. No. You gotta send somebody back from the dead. That'll capture their attention. You gotta wow them, right? A midnight haunting, the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, right? Scrooge. You gotta do something like that. And he said to him, Father Abraham says to him, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. In other words, they have the scriptures. They are sufficient. And what do the scriptures tell us? How do the scriptures direct us in how we are to be toward those on the margins, the poor, the immigrants, the widows, the orphans? You see, what they need to do is told in the scriptures, and that's sufficient. And if they're not going to believe that, and by the way, how do they demonstrate they believe it? They practice it. And if they don't practice that, because the scriptures are clear, I can send an army back from the dead and it ain't going to work. Okay, because it's really a matter of the heart and a disposition and paying attention to the scriptures. Okay, so that's what we got for today. Let's pray. Gracious God, thank you for the wonderful gift of this day. Thank you that you have given to each and every one of us extravagantly generous grace, that you have been extravagantly gracious with your grace. And so we just ask that we will in turn practice such grace to those around us in this day, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, friends, have a good day.